Okay, so let's move on into chapter 10, the counters of evidence. So, Rhoda's given some evidence or arguments for God's existence. Now he has to take into consideration evidence or arguments against God's existence. And unsurprisingly, he's going to deal with the two most well known arguments against belief in God, which are the problem of divine hiddenness, which is relatively new, as we learned from our reading of Schellenberg, and then the problem of suffering and evil. So for this video, we'll just talk about what he says about the problem of divine hiddenness, and relatively, he gives it a pretty quick treatment compared to what everything he says about suffering. And he opens up his story. By the way, you should have your handout out on chapter 10. He opens up the story with the king and the maiden, where the king, falls in love with this maiden from afar, but he wants to seek a relationship with her, but he knows he can't tell her he's king. So he has to actually kind of just act like he's a commoner in order to build friendship and maybe a potential romantic relationship. Okay, so what's Rhoda's issue with that, or what's he trying to show with that? Is I think he's saying God has to be at least somewhat distant from us, at least for a lot of people, in order to seek a love relationship with us. And page 144, fifth line down, if God's existence were obvious to all, it would be hard for people to refrain from viewing God in a Machiavellian manner, making the ultimate end into a mere means to power and pleasure for the self. All right, so that's going to be an explanation for why God kind of makes himself a little bit less obvious. I was you see this. I'm kind of a comic book nerd, but you also see this with some superheroes. I was actually watching The Flash the other day, but one of the heroes is trying to date someone new. But as a rule, or just they don't share about their superpowers early on, and the reason is because it could frighten people away, or it can make people too enamored by the powers rather than them, and they want to be like for them rather than the powers. So, that's another example I thought, in addition to the king maiden example. All right. So, here's how Rhoda formulates the divine hiddenness argument, and this is on the handout. If God existed, then he would make his existence If God existed, then he would make his existence obvious to everyone. But he hasn't made his existence obvious to everyone. Thus, God doesn't exist. Okay, now if you look at this, it's much less has much less detail and nuance as Schellenberg. Schellenberg's is it's much more full and complete and tries to plug in all possible holes. So and Rhoda's going to say, look, premise one we have reason to think is false, that God should make his existence maybe not obvious to everyone, because for the reasons that Rhoda gives. Using the king and maiden example. Okay, so does Rhoda give a satisfactory criticism of premise one? Would this criticism apply to Schellenberg's? Remember, Schellenberg has a reply to a lot of different different objections to the hiddenness argument. So I'm going to leave that up to you to think about whether what Rhoda says could be applied to Schellenberg, and then you can think about what sort of response Schellenberg might try to give to Rhoda. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about with the hiddenness argument. It's a little bit anticlimactic, but I do think since we talked about hiddenness so much, it's better to focus more on the problem of suffering. So that's next.